cannot download or run the application. Join from your browser. So it looks like it's not. So I could do download it and run Zoom.
Yeah, yeah. You download it first and then run Zoom.
Okay. Oh, here we go.
So I think we're
okay. Sounds good. So what I'm going to do is you could actually put down your phone.
Okay.
And then I'll hang up. And can you hear me okay? Great. And can you hear me okay, John?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me pump up your volume a little bit. Okay, awesome. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah.
First time we're doing something like this with you?
Yep.
Okay. This is the beauty of technology these days.
It is.
Might as well use it to the max.
Yep.
Cool. So I obviously have a bunch of questions to run over with you, but before we do that, I just want to see if maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit, maybe mention a couple of things about you. That way people who are watching this video will have a little bit of a better understanding of your background, where you're coming from, or maybe your influences.
Right. So should I start?
Yeah, please.
Yes, my name's John Ridgway. I'm an Australian. I lived in 5 countries initially. Of course, Australia, where I did my studies. I'm a solid-state physicist, have a PhD in semiconductor technology, and then I was working in the US for a couple of years. Then I was back to Australia, teaching in the university, then to India, where I was teaching at their #1 graduate school in Bangalore and teaching there for 6 years. Lived in India for about 18 years. Then we lived in Singapore for a couple of years. Our kids were born in born in India, grew up in India, and then they sort of middle school, high school in Singapore, and then Malaysia. We're there in Malaysia for 7 years. Then I've been in and out of Japan for about 10 years, and we've lived the last 15 years in Denver, Colorado.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, I was an industrial consultant in Asia, working for different multinationals, and specialized in cryogenics, and then the rubber glove industry, and a bunch of other stuff. So that's my kind of background. We have 2 children. One's married, has a baby, and the other one lives at home. And their names are Ranjani Ramabai, because in India, Pandita Ramabai Saraswati was a very famous Hindu that was a beautiful believer. Our son's name is Raja Sundar, after Sadhu Sundar Singh, who is also a very famous Indian who started a huge movement in North India. So our guys have lived all over the world, and I get involved, of course, through my work and where we live, with people from a Hindu background, Muslim background, Buddhist background, Shinto Buddhist mixed background, a secular background. and in the process of got involved in helping people from all these different backgrounds to know Jesus and discover his kingdom and to start the journey of following Jesus and then in turn influencing many others to do the same. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of my story.
Okay, awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to know Jesus? Family background a bit?
Yes. So I grew up in the country, but then we moved to the city of Sydney for our education. And my dad was a principal of schools, an inspector of schools. My mum was also a teacher, so I have a teaching background. And then during my university years, I did a science degree and then excelled at that. And so they went on to do a PhD. But in the middle of starting that, I met a man named Jack Griffin, who was a businessman who had come to faith through the Billy Graham crusade in 1959. Jack was a very successful businessman in spare parts for cars, import-export business. And then through the Billy Graham crusade, he found Jesus. And that was because his daughter, after 9 years, had been praying for her dad, for Jack and for May. And May was a part-time actress. So the local pastor came around and invited them to the Billy Graham crusade at that time, which was 40 days long. So wow. Jack said to May, we better go the first night because otherwise this guy will plague us for 39 nights. So they went the first night. And sure enough, George Beverly Shea was singing, I'd rather have Jesus than silver or gold. God really touched Jack's heart. And his daughter, of course, has been praying for over 9 years. He went forward. It was because it was a church function. They'd got separated, and May was in a bus with some ladies. And so she went forward, and together they saw each other on the big Sydney cricket ground and held each other's hands and went forward and became believers. Mm-hmm. Well, Jack was discipled by a man named Bob Glockner, who was on the Billy Graham team, and Bob was a very successful businessman in Minneapolis, had 5 restaurants, and he started to write notes to Jack, and then the notes got longer and longer, and he encouraged Jack to find some young men. And so Jack had never finished high school, but he felt a bit awkward to go out to the university, but Bob encouraged him, and he went out. And one day I saw this man coming along, short, fat, successful, and he walked straight up to me and he said, my name's Jack Griffin. Can I join you for lunch? And I was so sort of taken aback. We sat down very friendly. And then we got chit-chatting, and he said, what do you know about Jesus? And I said, not much. Anyway, he started to explain the good news to me, and of course I had a lot of questions, and I kind of couldn't figure out who this guy was anyway. But you couldn't help liking him, and after a couple of weeks, he showed up again, and so we started to meet every 2 weeks and had these discussions, and they went on for 2 years. Because in the meantime, I read the 24 volumes of the Harvard Classics of the religions of the world to sort of debate with Jack, but Jack wasn't interested. He'd just say, well, John, it's all Greek to me, or I'm just a simple man. And he'd say, once I was blind, now I see. And he was just quite a character, actually. But I couldn't help liking him. And after a couple of years, this was 1965 to 1967, and another man named Leroy Iams came to Australia, and he spoke, and Jack recruited a whole bunch of us guys to go and hear him. And so that was the turning point where I decided to really let go of my life and offer my life to the Lord and follow him. And so Jack followed us guys up, that 5 of us, and we'd meet at his place every Saturday morning at 7 a.m., which was extremely early for us students. But anyway, we managed to get there on time. And if we got there at 6:45, he'd have some toast and coffee and all. And we started. And over the next 5 years, Jack just steadily built in some disciplines in my life that really made a tremendous difference. And the huge thing about Jack was he just loved God. And every time you'd see the way he read the Bible was so simple, and God would teach him such beautiful truths. Just one of them, for example, is 2 Corinthians 11:3. But I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. And he'd say, John, just keep it simple. In fact, in the front of his Bible, he had KISS, keep it simple, stupid. But he said, if you're talking to the Archbishop of Sydney, which we did on one occasion, it's keep it simple, sir. And so he had another one, SIB, see it big. Every person you meet, it might be the next Billy Graham or whatever. So he just, verse after verse, just sort of burnt into my brain. And so those were exciting years. We saw over 100 of our friends come to faith on the university campus. And Graham French and myself, of course, then later on, we both went to India, and they were exciting years. But in between, before I went to India, I was in Colorado Springs for 2 years working as an assistant to a man named Waldron Scott, who got me reading every possible book on culture and cross-cultural communication. An extremely well-read man that put together a major presentation for the Lausanne 74 Congress. But and then I had a year with Jerry White, who was then running the Air Force Academy Ministry, and I was his assistant, and we developed the first staff training institute, and we saw over 100 cadets come to faith that year at the Air Force Academy. So exciting years, lots of fun. And then, of course, headed for India, where I was there for 18 years, the first 6 years teaching at the Indian Institute of Science. Then worked for different multinationals and brought in technology from the US and Australia. And through that, of course, met many Hindu businessmen. And in my PhD classes that I was teaching, a lot of sharp young men. And so little by little, learning how to help people understand the exciting journey of experiencing God personally. And that's been a very interesting journey, and I've learned many things, mostly the hard way. And that's been a journey now for 40 years. So exciting stuff.
Yeah, awesome. So just wanted to ask a couple of questions about your early years in India. What was your approach and your philosophy of how to reach people, connect with people at that point, and how did it evolve and why did it evolve?
Yes. Well, initially we thought, we'll try and reach students, because I'd been on a university campus in Sydney, and the guys in the US all talked about campus ministries. So we looked up in the internet and raced out to the Bangalore University, 55,000 students. We thought, wow, that'll be a lot of students. Well, we find this one building. It's turned out to be an administration building. And of course, we didn't quite understand how things worked. And we asked, where's the 55,000 students? They said, well, they're spread all over Bangalore. And they just have little colleges all over the place. And each of these colleges has, maybe 5,000 students associated with it. And they don't have dormitories like we're used to, or places where students can come. And so it's just, there's no cafeteria. There's just classrooms. Students come, do their studies and take off again. So we discovered that wasn't exactly a place where we could sit around and drink coffee and chat to students. So that was very helpful, because what it forced us to do was to think, where do people hang out? And pretty quickly we figured out they hang out in their own families. and they may play cricket in the street with all the other guys, and they may have a soccer ball or something, but basically everything happens in the local communities. And
right.
yeah, so then we realized, well, the key was to relate not to individuals, but to relate to families. And if we related to families, of course, we got to know mums and dads and cousins and uncles, and everybody hangs out, and it all runs through what you call the bloodlines, through the relationships in a family. Then we discovered that's very strong, and people will do anything for their own family members. Now, it wasn't that everything's smooth, but there's a strong commitment, firstly, to your own family and community. So that was a big shift, and it shifted us away from necessarily students, still attracted to young men, but young men in the context of families. And so we would relate to, that way we could relate to Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, any family, because we just make friends in the neighborhood and build the friendships. Now, the next big thing that was huge was in the West, we tend to do a kind of treat evangelism as a project. You know, we go out and witness to people, or we pass out tracts or whatever. Well, we quickly figured out that that wasn't very successful in a Hindu country. And what was key was making friendships. Then, of course, we realized, like all these things, that's what Jesus did. Just had friends. And we kind of, a lot of things we didn't grasp at that point. For example, we thought everybody should be witnessing and running around. But as we got into the scriptures, which was something that we did right from the beginning, and we found we had a lot of questions. We found that God didn't ask the entire Jewish nation to go out and reach the nations. He took 12 apostles. And so there are certain people who are gifted in evangelism and reaching people. And so it's not everybody does that, but everybody's gifted in some way. And so you need all the gifts. And we didn't understand the gifting very well either. But as time went on, we discovered that there's apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers, the ones that are mentioned in the book of Ephesians. And then we discovered there's even more gifts, but those are what you'd call the equipping gifts. And in the process, we realized that not everybody that goes overseas is necessarily designed to reach people overseas. Some people just are much more effective in their own country. And so the idea of a missionary, well, in our case, it's just the grace of God. We all had to get jobs because there are no missionary visas available. So I applied for a job, postdoctoral fellowship, and I got that. But that was another huge factor that became very important for us as time went on, is that a working person is far more effective than a full-time Christian worker, because the full-time Christian worker is stuck in the Christian world. And in India, you can't go evangelizing other religious communities. That's just, you can't do that. And in fact, if you do, there's anti-conversion laws in almost all states in India. So we quickly discovered that the working person is a natural person for relating to people at work, in the neighborhood, and people trust you. Whereas if they smell that you're kind of a foreign evangelist or foreign pastor or something, a Christian worker, they keep their distance from you. So that was another huge piece. I think one of the things that we discovered was that, which we didn't realize at the beginning, is everybody has a first birth as well as a second birth. And the first birth relates to where they're born and what time in history they're born, Acts 17. And then we discovered that 1 Corinthians 7, he says, well, the assignment that you've been given is your first birth, and then your calling is your second birth, is 1 Corinthians 7:17. And so where a person's born and where a person grows up are all from God. They're not sort of flukes or mistakes in history that where I'm born, if I'm from a Hindu background in India, in the Kannada community, that's from God. That's what Acts 17:26 tells us. So that changed everything. We realized, oh, God has ordained every person's first birth because their first birth becomes significant for the mobility of the gospel. They can explain the good news to another Hindu far more quickly than I could. And then as they experienced Jesus, we realized that the second birth was not a decision as so much as a journey. And 1 Peter 1:17 says, your life is a journey you must experience with a deep consciousness of God. So it's a journey. It starts at a certain point where I begin to believe in Jesus, and then his Spirit comes and lives in me, and that's eternal life. When his Spirit lives in me, I've started a journey that goes on into eternity. Now, of course, I'm a bit of a mess, and so God has had to sort out my mess, and his Son, through his death and resurrection, provided forgiveness and reconciliation, and so I could start this journey. Well, the exciting thing is we would let people read John's Gospel, for example, and we wouldn't make any comments. We'd just read it with them. We'd let them make their comments. Now, initially, we tried to explain the Gospel using bridge illustration or 4 laws or steps to peace with God and these sort of tracks. But most people didn't connect at all, because first of all, what's a sinner, and what do you mean I'm a sinner? In India, that means somebody that robs banks and kills people. The average person doesn't do that, so he didn't understand what's this word sinner. And they didn't understand words like justification or justification by faith or propitiation or all this lingo. So one of the things we found is just let the Bible speak for itself. And so in different Indian languages and the Good News Bible in English, we would just use John's Gospel and other Gospels and let the person read and let them see what they figured out. And normally we switched from trying to evangelize to just listening to people. And as we sensed there was some sort of interest, we would ask, would you be interested to start a journey of figuring out who is Jesus? And nobody has a problem with that. If I say, oh, Jesus is God, nobody believes that. I mean, the Christians believe that. So that's a dead end. But if I ask, would you be interested to figure out or start a journey of figuring out who is Jesus? The person says, well, what do you mean? So then I'll pull out 2 John's Gospels in an easy to follow language, and I'll read the first page and he'll read the second page, and I'll say, anything interesting there? And sometimes there's not much. Sometimes he sees something or has a question. We chat for a few minutes. And I say, well, if you like this, there's no agenda, as he could tell. We could meet in a couple of weeks and do the same thing and have a coffee and chat. So in India, that was very natural. And so we started doing that. And then we quickly get involved with his family and learn who dad and mom. And because we were all working, the initial team of 50 expats, everybody had jobs, then families are comfortable. They can kind of feel, oh, this guy's an ordinary guy. He works hard. He's talented. He's come from overseas. And so there was a good feeling. And this, as things went along, the family could see that what I was talking about was good news, that life could be, radically different with Jesus. And we weren't talking about Christianity. We weren't talking about another religion. They continued in their Hindu or Muslim traditions, but now Jesus was living in them and beginning to change them. So there were some of the things, and I think there's just many, many more that we wrestle with in the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So typically in the West, what we would do with somebody who is not yet a follower of Jesus is we try to get them to come to church. We try to get them to maybe go through like a program for people who are are kind of looking into Christianity a little bit more or something like that. What do you think about this type of approach? Does it depend on the context, or in general is a less formal approach, or whatever you want to call it, a little bit better? What's your opinion, experience with that?
Yes, actually what you're describing is something that generally works in the Christian world. Inviting a person to church, they're sort of familiar with that, and if it's a welcoming kind of church they enjoy and so forth. So that approach. But as soon as we're amongst Hindus or Buddhists or Shinto or Muslims, that doesn't work at all, because those buildings in their minds represent that religion, because that's how they understand religion. It's a place of worship. And so they don't want to get anywhere near a church building or anything that smells Christian, because that's not their turf. And it's not that they hate Christianity, but they sometimes are hostile to the Christian presence because of economic reasons or political reasons or military reasons. So they kind of, and they're not interested in other religions, generally speaking, which is true of a Christian. They're not particularly interested in other religions. Right. So what we do is just introduce them to Jesus. And nobody wants to argue about Jesus. Everybody acknowledges that he was a good man. Now, they may not believe he's God, they may not believe he's the Son of God, but nobody believes he's a bad man. And so, as a consequence, by starting a journey of figuring out who is Jesus, always the person is attracted to Jesus. Now, not necessarily they're going to follow him, but many times they do. Then the next thing is to introduce them to the kingdom of God rather than the church. The church is a physical structure. The kingdom of God's a spiritual structure. So the kingdom of God works within any religious framework. And so as a person becomes a citizen of the kingdom, the king is the one in charge, not the bishop or the pope or somebody else. The king is the one of authority. And we become fellow travelers together, in a sense, part of a huge family that is all over the world. And there's no rules or regulations. Everything's determined by relationships. So there's not things for the Jewish religion, of course, there were many rules and many regulations. But for the citizen of the kingdom, his primary relationship is with God, and the next relationship is with people, both believers and people not yet believers. So this is a beautiful framework, because relationships are everything, and everybody wants good relationships. So as a consequence, once we introduce them to the kingdom, they can be sitting in their mosque or any place and begin to worship Jesus. They can be at home, and we can be reading the Bible, and because the Bible doesn't belong just to Christians, it belongs to everybody. And so we can look at the Bible. And now, of course, even the word Bible smells very Christian. So in many places, what we do is just do some Xerox copies of the Gospel of John and so help remove those sort of red flags for people from a non-Christian background. Mm-hmm. And once they begin to experience Jesus, they love the scriptures, and it becomes their book. But many times it can be like in Canada, in the Karnataka state in southern India, the name is the Satya Veda. And Satya means true, and Veda means scriptures, the Hindu scriptures, but it applies to any scriptures. So when they see Satya Veda, it feels good. It feels like their religion. Or in the Islamic world, the Injil, very familiar. It's an Arabic word meaning good news. So when we use their terminology, it becomes very acceptable. And so they can read the Bible, Christianity in it. It's amazing how much sort of Christian stuff is flooded into our Bibles. So the Schofield Bible would be a classic example with dispensationalism that, many Christians believe, but not necessarily always that well supported from Scripture. But anyway, so the key for somebody working in another context is to keep it very simple. It's a relationship with Jesus, Jesus the King, and that his kingdom is his framework, which is purely relational. Invisible, it's spiritual, it's eternal, and it has no physical markers.
Yeah.
It's the parables that Jesus told all the time. He'd say, well, the kingdom of heaven is like this. People couldn't figure out what he was talking about, but it was always relationships. And so that's a huge piece. And as a person from a Muslim, a Hindu, Buddhist, when they see that I respect their first birth, that that's who they are, and that as a Hindu, as a Muslim, they second birth. So their testimony is really, I'm a Hindu, but I follow Jesus. I'm a Muslim, but I follow Isa al-Masih. So they have a first birth and a second birth identity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. When you're back here in the States and you're reaching out to people, does your approach change at all since it's a different context than India? If so, how does it change? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Now, if for example, what I find, if I'm in a Christian community, most of our time actually spent amongst just the ordinary, you could say, secular American who doesn't go to church or is not interested in spiritual things. He's playing golf or doing something else on Sundays, or mowing his lawn, or having a beer with a neighbor or something. So generally that's where we're hanging out. But if I'm with the Christian community, then I change gears and talk in a way that they feel comfortable. With my non-Christian friends, they don't talk religious lingo, so I don't just talk in the normal local lingo. And then with the Christians, I really encourage them to begin to pray for all their family members, and begin to pray for their work colleagues, and then pray for neighbors. And so I try to get them praying about people around them. And normally, of course, their approach is to take them to church. Well, that's okay too. I mean, that'll work. Usually, if it's a pretty friendly community, that works great. But the church generally is not equipped to reach the non-Christian, the secular person, except to invite them to a special meeting, give them a tract, or invite them to a Bible study. But the average person is not too interested in that. So we've related to all of our neighbours where we live, and none of them go to church in our street at all. There's not a single person, which we don't mind, because we've made good friends with everybody. And we chit-chat on Sundays about gardening and about cars and about the football and what's going on. And in the process, we build friendships. And so the principle is still the same in terms of relationships. We build those friendships. But it's not done in terms of a structure as it is in terms of a relationship. And then as they become interested, and we've had 2 neighbours show some interest, then we'll invite them over to our place, and we'll chit-chat, have coffee, and ask similar questions. Would you be interested to kind of figure out who is Jesus? And because Jesus is pretty well known in this country, they say, well, I'll say, well, what do you mean we have to figure out who is Jesus? Then I'll say, well, let's maybe look at the Gospels and see what they say about who is Jesus. And we'll do the same thing. Now, generally these days, the second, third generations of people who are originally good believers is kind of faded. Yeah. The average person isn't very cluey on the Bible at all. It's sort of just a strange book. So by just reading, say, John's Gospel and chit-chatting, I'm doing that with a couple of single guys right now, and a married guy, and we on FaceTime every 2 weeks, and we're chit-chatting our way through John's Gospel, and they're loving it, and they've just started the journey of figuring out who is Jesus, and so it's a slow, but very encouraging, exciting journey. So in some ways, the principles are the same, except here I'm generally thinking in terms of a secular framework versus, say, a religious framework in Malaysia.
Okay, great. You were mentioning that some people are gifted with evangelism and those people are called to do that. Does that imply that other people should not do that, or what does that imply?
Yes. Well, it's interesting that every person influences. I mean, who was it? One time, one of the big companies, IBM, they did an analysis of how many relationships we have in a lifetime, and they estimated 164. So if a person does nothing, they have a relationship with that many people, maybe very slim, but something. And so one of the keys we found is as a person starts to change, it's their life that really impacts people. And over, I've had guys say, "Oh, I knew Harold, this is my cousin. He wasn't. He was a rough guy. Now he's different." And so what I find is that everybody influences by their life. Every parent does that with their children. All of us influence others because of who we are, and that's probably the most powerful way of touching other people is just our lives. Now, I think what happens is there are some people who can articulate their faith very well. And that's usually the apostle, prophet, evangelist kind of person who also may be just gifted in knowing how to open up the conversation very naturally. Now, some people can do that. Other people really struggle to do that. But what I find is everybody's got oodles of friends. Now, some people may have 5 friends, another person may have 20 friends, another person may have 100 sort of social type friends. So what I do is link that person with somebody who's more gifted in the evangelism, and then he can chat to this guy's friends, not because they're strangers, but because he's running on the relationship with the person that's got all the friends. So I find when you combine these gifts, that really helps. And so you need, apostles can often see things in scriptures that others don't see so easily. Prophets are usually quite perceptive about people and can see the issues that are going on. Probably the evangelist is often just such a natural, usually very sort of bubbly kind of person that just loves everybody, huge heart. And then you've got pastors who are very caring people. You've got teachers who can just open up the scriptures. And you need all of these giftings. Some people in administration, some people finances. All of these gifts, when they work together, become very powerful. And so in that sense, but the common factor to everybody is a changed life. So if my life's changing, it naturally is attractive to others.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So some people might be natural networkers, and they have a lot of people who are drawn to them, but they might not be especially gifted at starting up spiritual conversations, let's say. That's why you kind of partner with somebody who is good at that. That way you can have that synergy going on, yeah?
Yep, exactly, yeah. And it's all through Scripture. You got Peter and John, and Peter and James and John, and you've got Paul and Timothy, and Paul and Titus, and Paul and Barnabas, and you have these combinations all through Scripture. And that's been my experience through my whole lifetime, is that on my own I'm okay, but if I've got someone that compliments me and I compliment him, that's very powerful. And you got even 3 people can do that or more, but that's usually if you got 2 or 3 friends that are gifted differently, they really complement each other.
Mm-hmm. Work as a team.
Yes, yep.
Yep. Okay, awesome. Let's see. So I do have some questions I want to rattle off with you. And some of these are common questions that a lot of people who are from Christian backgrounds might have.
Yes.
One common question is, what is the biblical definition of church?
Yes, a great question. And there's 28 different ways in which the people of God are described in the New Testament. For example, followers, believers, disciples, the body of Christ, bride of Christ, the field, on and on. There's just many different ways the people of God are described. One of the most useful ways for me is the word oikos. It occurs about 114 times in the New Testament, similar to another word that's usually used called ecclesia. And the word ecclesia is used about the same number of times. In the Old Testament, the word oikos occurs over 900 times. And because household was something that was very common right from the beginning. So Genesis 12, 1-3, God gives Abraham the good news. He says, this is the gospel that was announced to Abraham beforehand. Through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So right in the heart of the gospel is family. And so God's natural unit is a family. And so the word household is very descriptive because we all understand how a family works or it doesn't work. It involves a leader, usually the dad, and then it involves different members, and they all have to communicate to make the family work. So it's a great way of describing the people of God, in the sense of just consisting of many families, but the family itself is the initial basic unit that is true in every society and every culture. Now, within every culture, there's different groupings. Some have got clans and some have got caste systems and some other different kinds of ways of describing the society. But everybody understands family. Now, the word ecclesia was actually a legal term that was used in Acts 19, and it was used as more of a political, legal term, a gathering of people to decide something. It was also used very much in the political sense of a group of people coming out of their houses, and the emperor would send messengers all through the empire, and a trumpet, and then people would come out of their homes. That gathering was called an ecclesia, meaning two words, ek and ecclesia, ek meaning out of, come out of, and ecclesia means to call out. So it was just a word, political and also legal. But Paul liked, in the sense, the nature of that word is just a group of people. So he captured that word and talked it in terms of being a church. Now, the crazy thing is that's a long ways from where we are today, where church is considered usually a building, or a congregation that meets in a building, and we've got all sorts of words that describe all that. But interesting that the change happened when King James, who authorized the King James Bible, it's interesting, isn't it? He had the divine right of kings in those days. And so there were 4 translations before his in English, but he authorized his, meaning he negated the previous 4, which were all very good translations, the Geneva Bible, the Great Bible, and we had even a famous man that started the initial translations. His name just slips me at the moment. But these translations, interestingly enough, tended to translate this word ecclesia into English as a gathering. And but King James said no. He wanted that word translated and used the word church. Now, the word church comes from a German word, which was the previous language that the Bible was translated in. Kyrke, and kyrke comes from a Greek word, kyrikon. And kyrikon, it means a religious building. And so that's how that word, English word church, that's why everybody thinks of it as a religious building.
Right.
But your pastor or teacher will say, well, actually, we are the people of God. We're the church. And so the word kind of gets used in two different ways. One is from the scriptures, is just the people of God. And then the other way is it's a building where the people of God meet. But, the Paul in Ephesians, he didn't build the building in Ephesus. He didn't construct something there. He didn't have singing. He didn't have a pastor. None of that. It was just families spread all over Ephesus. And it was God that was building his church. And he connected relationally, but the building that was being built was God's building. So in Ephesians 2:20, he says he's putting you and I together brick by brick, piece by piece, and this beautiful structure is daily growing. And he says, that's where I live. This is what God's talking about. So his thinking on church, God's thinking, is very different. It's just people in relationship to one another. So you and I are chatting. Now, we're not in the same community, we're not in the same city, but we have a relationship. And so that makes a church.
Mm-hmm.
He said, if there's two of you, I'm there too. If there's two or three, then I'm also there. So the nature of church is, again, relational. And now if we turn it into a physical thing, is something meeting that happens on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock, and there's a pastor and a service and all. We've now constructed a religion, basically Christianity. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of our history, but it's not necessarily biblical. God's not limited to any structures. I mean, he'll work in and through anything and everybody, whatever they are and whatever they're attempting to do. Where he finds a person whose heart's very open to God, then God can use that person regardless of the structures.
Right. Can you run us through the history of things a bit? So nowadays, church is a building, it's an organization, it's a meeting Sunday morning with bells and whistles. How did this happen? Did it happen yesterday, 100 years ago? And what was the important historical points that kind of shaped our understanding of where things are today, as opposed to a time before that? Maybe a little bit of insight.
Yes, another great question. And the reason is because Constantine in 325 AD, because he was concerned about the growth of this movement of the gospel all over the place, all over the Roman Empire, he couldn't quite get his fingers on it because movements don't lend to that. They can't control a movement. But he was concerned, and he was a political guy, so he wanted to control that. So what he did was, because by that time in 300s, in the 4th century there, the Christians numbered more than 10% of the Roman Empire. So it was a pretty significant number. So then he created a state church. Now, up to that time, the money that was, for taxes and so forth, went into the religious buildings of the day. So Jupiter is a huge construct there, and up in where Paul and Damascus, and so you had all these buildings to the different gods and so forth. But what he did was he formulated the first church building. And by this time, Constantine, of course you can tell by his name, he had shifted the center of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD to Constantinople. And he'd shifted from Rome to Constantinople. He was expanding, in other words, the Roman Empire. And he named it after himself, typical of these guys. Super huge egos. And he built this massive structure in Constantinople. it was really like a Roman forum. But he appointed a man in charge because he figured out from the other religions you need a guy in charge. And all the religions had these groups of musicians dressed in very fancy outfits and all kinds of instruments. And so that was the beginnings of the what we have in the Christian world, the church choirs. And so he brought these people into the building. He said he basically put together the liturgy. He said there can be some singing, and then we'll have announcements from the emperor, and we'll have people take up a collection to keep the building in good shape. And then we can have a typical Roman approach, 3 points in a poem, the Greek orators of the day, and then close with another song. So he put together a construct, and it was very much almost what we've got 2,000 years later. And it went through all kinds of processes, but he basically formulated a Christian liturgy. And then he spent money like crazy from Constantinople through to Rome, through to Jerusalem, building all these buildings, and he named them after the apostles. So the Church of St. John, the Church of St. Peter, Church of St. Luke, and so there were just hundreds of these buildings. And this way he could control things. And he passed an edict at that time, about 326 AD, that anybody that met outside of one of these official buildings was death. So he basically killed any possibilities of sort of informal sessions, meetings that went outside of these buildings. So you can see why today, even now in the Christian world, they're very suspect of anything happening outside of the church building and the church program and so forth. It all went back to those days. Now, of course, the spiritual side slowly weakened and the good news faded. The kingdom of God faded completely because it was now all about the ecclesiastical structures, and the papacy, reigned, and there was a constant battle between Pope's man and the political world. And so all through Europe, you'll find that the government structure and the church structure, the size of the steeples were very important as to who was running the show in that city. And so this went on until until Martin Luther, a German Lutheran professor, 1517, it kind of took on the Pope of the day and the papacy and the leaders of the cardinals and all, and said this is what all the kind of approach they were selling, whether people could buy their way into heaven or get out of hell, and they had all these means by which people could pay money and escape the terrors of hell. And Martin Luther said, no, this is not what the church is supposed to be teaching. Well, he unraveled again the good news of it's by faith alone. But the structures still were maintained, the physical structures. And so he was financed, or he was backed by Frederick the Great, who had the third largest standing army in Europe. And so Frederick the Great himself wanted to be the Pope. It was a pretty powerful position. So he backed Martin Luther. And sure enough, since Martin Luther sort of won the day, there's probably many Martin Luthers before Martin Luther, but they all got killed. But anyway, he offered Martin Luther all the pulpits of Northern Europe. Well, that was too big a temptation. And so Martin Luther then removed the confession box and put the mighty pulpit, the Protestant pulpit, in the center of the church building. And so that became the Protestant movement, which was protesting all the way and has continued to protest. And we have approximately a new denomination every 2 to 3 days today. So that's our strength. We're protesters. We've probably overdone it now, but anyway, we were protesting against the papacy at that time, which had ruled Europe for about 5 centuries. And so interesting enough, the Islamic world had a golden age at about the same time, about the 7th century to the 14th century AD. And it was the Islamic world that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages and then into the Renaissance and into what we now know today. Well, so the history of the church has been why we have what we have today. It just runs at least 1800 years. Mm-hmm. And it was just because he was literally a dictator and a one-time ruler, he determined everything, and that structure suited the Romans, and it suited. So a lot of our terms if you're in an Anglican background or Presbyterian background or whatever, a lot of the terms are Romans, So we talk about the church, then we talk about the pulpit is a typical Roman word. Yeah, there's just scores of these words that are used. So the guy would preach from the pulpit. I would sit in a pew and listen to the preacher from the pulpit. So I had all these sort of Roman terms, and even the way that the area was described was a diocese. We live in this diocese. So all Roman words. So they really formulated the whole Christian structure very strongly. And there's been breakaways from that over the years with people like John Wesley and so forth, but it's been tough going. Now, of course, after World War II, there was a tremendous burst of energy, and a lot of what they call parachurch movements started. Basically, people said, the church is not doing its job, and so you had many groups, including the Navigators and Campus Crusade and Young Life and Every Home Crusade and on, just scores of these parachurch groups, which in the end often morphed into denominations. But that was, and today there's about 950 movements of the gospel around the world. It's amazing. And there's probably more people in these movements. In India, for example, we estimate that probably 80% of the body of Christ are in these movements. And nobody counts them. They run in the thousands and probably in the hundreds of thousands. I know several groups that are around 500,000, Well, you never even get a mega pastor with a church that big. So you can see that God's ways are just way beyond our usual thinking.
Mm-hmm. So after Constantine put in his plans, there was a big shift in terms of how the Christian faith was expressed or lived out. And it was completely lost until Martin Luther kind of saved it a little bit.
Yeah, yes and no. Actually, the interesting thing is there's a fascinating Kenneth Scott Latourette is probably the most significant author of the church today. He wrote 7 volumes, The History and Expansion of Christianity. And what he did was follow the movements of the gospel, not so much the organized church structures. Yep. And that is huge. People today usually aren't aware of all this. But in India, for example, we estimate at least the official figures for the Christianity is about 2%. But we estimate there's probably another 8% that are movements of the gospel. Millions and millions and millions of people. And they don't go to a building. They just meet informally in their homes. They maintain their religious background. They love Jesus. They're not afraid to die for their faith. And these are all over the country, probably another 8%. But I think what God does is he protects that. He keeps it hidden. Because if it was out there in the open, politicians would lose their grip on things and really freak out. In India, the Muslims are about 11%. So that's a big enough minority to, you cannot ignore that size of people. I mean, talking again, millions of people. maybe 20 million people more. So you can't ignore those kind of, but I think with the movements of the gospel, nobody, because they're inside Hinduism, they're inside Islam, they're not a threat. But they're very powerful because they touch people's lives individually and family-wise.
Mm-hmm.
So the quick answer is, yeah, there's been a lot happening. We've just been talking about the organized institutional historical church, but the movements of the gospel have been going on right from the beginning, and they've just walked around these institutions and gone on. And so you've got huge movements of the gospel been happening all through history. But it's not recorded for us. I mean, we later picked up a lot of the signals, but in a sense, God's work's just been continually growing. And we may look at, the growth of Islam and the growth of Christianity and so forth, but the movements of the gospel have always been there and just continue to flourish.
Okay. So the movement of Gospels might not make it into the history books.
Right.
Okay.
Which is, I think, God's way of protecting them, because you can't shoot something that you can't see. So it's God's mercy and grace, I think, that these things just keep happening. And whereas in India, the institutional church is targeted all the time. So when there's arguments between the Hindus and the Muslims and the Christians, always they go for their buildings. So they'll burn down mosques, they'll burn down churches, they'll burn down temples, they'll throw pigs in the mosque, and they'll do everything to kind of fire up the whole situation, because the building is the target. That's something physical. So in most churches in India today, you have 2 or 3 policemen positioned outside the church on a Sunday to protect.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and of course, that's what was huge in China when in fact, the Mao Zedong demolished the 2 or 3 layers of the Christian religion, and we were left with just people without any resources in one sense, physically, but they continued relationally to keep growing and expanding and so on. So God's work just is not limited by the physical structures. The physical structures are okay, they're neutral. I mean, a building is just a building. But how it's used, of course, is what determines whether it's good or bad.
Right.
Yeah.
And we talked about the first birth and the second birth. This concept, obviously, we see it in the New Testament. Did it get lost after a while and then rediscovered? And what was the process of this history?
Yes. Well, interesting. It was clear in the early church, and whether from a Greek background, Roman background, Corinthian background, it was those first births were recognized by Jesus, recognized by Paul. And so the movements of the gospel usually maintained that, because movements would run into the Hindu world, Muslim world, Buddhist world, and they would respect the person's first birth. Whereas the tendency in the Christian world was to pull people out of their religious background and in a sense, Christianize them, which is what the Judaizers were doing in the book of Acts. They wanted all these Gentiles to be Jews. And so they were squeezing them to take circumcision and so forth. And so that's flourished all through the centuries as well, that the Christians usually try to Christianize anybody outside of the Christian world. So, and that's sort of successful. It's proselytization. But it doesn't enable the gospel to flow through the religions. It drains a few individuals out of that religion. So in that sense, where the gospel really makes an impact is where people have understood the first birth, second birth. Now, they may not have articulated it, but they practiced it. In other words, they accepted the person's first birth, they appreciated the person, and helped them understand Jesus. So in that sense, again, that principle has been there right from the beginning, and through the movements has been sustained. What's happened is the Christian church has lost it. So just as the Christian church has lost kingdom, they've also lost important understandings like the first birth, second birth. So that's why we kind of have rediscovered these things, not because they weren't already there, we just didn't know about them. And because of my case, from a Christian background, I didn't even think about first birth, second birth, until I related to Hindus and Muslims and realized, whoops, there's something I don't understand here. So that's the exciting thing, is when people get involved in other cultures and other religions, their thinking is forced to change. Just like the Apostle Paul, he didn't have the thing figured out 3 years in Arabia before he started to kind of understand faith. And then 12 years before he's starting to figure out something of the gospel and how it relates to the nations. And then those first 3 journeys we have in the book of Acts, every journey he's learning something new. And he kind of, in the Corinthian scene, he starts to understand how temples work and how can we function in the temple and so forth. And in Ephesus, beautiful understanding of the church, which was totally relational and had nothing to do with buildings and whatever. So you can see, for a man who came from a pretty structured religion, it was amazing that God sort of unraveled so much for him. And the same thing today, God gives us the privilege of unraveling a whole lot of truths in whatever context we're in. I think God just delights that we can explore and search out and figure out stuff. And it usually comes by, mistakes and experiences and so forth.
So in some countries, the governments don't allow church buildings and organized official religious expressions.
Yep.
From a movement point of view, that's actually might be favorable rather than unfavorable, right? Would you speak into that a little bit?
Yes, very much. And the Christians don't quite catch that point, because whenever they see the church, quote, persecuted, buildings destroyed and all that, they feel things are going backwards. But in another sense, things are actually going forward, because people that love Jesus in these Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, they keep flourishing, and they're not held back by buildings. In fact, in one sense, Christianity can be quite a headache for the movements of the gospel, because they get people going the wrong direction. They get them focused on structures instead of on relationships. So when the physical institutions suffer, it's not good, but when they suffer, normally that helps movements, because they don't have that competition going on trying to extract people out of their religion into the Christian scene. So, and that's why the movements usually are way more substantial than the physical institutional church.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier how in India it was helpful for you and your buddies to have regular jobs as a way to relate with regular other people, right?
Right.
Now, is there a place for a full-time Christian vocational worker in certain contexts, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, actually there is. And it's usually through service organizations. So where people need computer skills, people need educational skills, where people need clean water, where they need medical facilities. There's a lot of service organizations where the people are full-time and can really bless the situation. Now, there's many organizations like that today in the world. And so those service organizations are very valuable, because oftentimes when you serve people, sort out water issues, help them establish, drinking water and then medical issues. I've been involved with quite a bit with the leprosy situations. People are very appreciative. And when you serve them, that often opens up the door for the good news. You don't have to be a Christian organization. You just have to be somebody who loves Jesus. And so I encourage people, if you're not geared up as a professional person, business-wise or educationally or whatever, don't worry, join a service organization. And then through that, you can often get doors that are wide open. If you just wanted to minister to the Christians in the country, you can come in on some sort of Christian visa. That'll work if your objective is to help the Christians relate to the lost. And sometimes that can include Hindus and Muslims. Usually the church is very good at that, but somebody that's got that stuff figured out and wants to, say, mobilize Christians in India, that's a huge contribution. Normally they can't get a visa. The government doesn't give visas, that sort of thing. But they sometimes give visas for medical specialists. They have people that have got agricultural skills, farming, technology, and so forth. So there's a lot of areas that a country's itchy. If you can work in those areas, you have a lot of natural outreach. But the full-time pastor or Christian worker usually can't access these non-Christian scenes. And so they can work within the Christian community and maybe mobilize Christians to reach out to the lost. So, by the way, I may have to wind up in about 5 minutes here. So,
okay, sounds good. We could always add on another time.
Yeah.
Going forward. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. The rest of the questions are kind of all connected with one another. Oh, you've seen them. So do we want to maybe try to do another time going forward?
Yes, that'll be great.
Okay.
My time's kind of really tight at the moment because Ruth goes in for an ablation on Monday.
Okay.
And it's a major operation, be 4.5 hours. And then I leave 29th of August for a month in Malaysia, Singapore, India, Indonesia, and then back in October. So we could schedule something in October and pick up. Is that
great?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, thank you so much for your time, John.
Oh, man, I'm sorry I had to keep juggling it around.
I think we talked about some very significant issues.
Yes.
Because a lot of people don't understand that what we see today has to do with some key players kind of doing things and changing things and kind of making it the new normal.
Right.
While sometimes we think like, oh, this is how it's normally like, but it's important for us to understand that, well, maybe that might not be the best way or the only way.
Yes. Yeah. No, I was very happy, Mike, about tonight because I thought these were the real meat of the sandwich. I mean, this is the stuff that really counts. And if people get this stuff right, wow.
Yeah, that's a good start.
Yep. So what would you do now with this recording?
Well, if you're okay with it, I could put it online and people can watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think I've said anything that's sensitive.
Okay.
And
we didn't use anybody's personal name except Constantine.
Yeah, right.
And if your name is Constantine, we're not picking on you.
So, well, that's neat. Do you put it on YouTube? Where do you?
I can do that.
Okay, well, that's great. if it needs editing or whatever, I don't know what you think, but
I think it went pretty smooth.
okay.
Yeah, I can understand everything.
Okay, even my poor Australian accent that's somewhat mutilated these days.
I can get it.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's great, Mike. Well, yeah, and we'll work on another session maybe in October there.
Sounds good. Thanks. Happy travels, and our
Yeah.
prayers are going to be with you, Ruth, and your trip out there.
Yes, thanks. That'll be great. And for Ruth on Monday, that'll be a big.
Sounds good. Monday.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
Well, great, Mike. I'll disappear and
Okay.
eat some food and
Have
stuff.
a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Now, where are you? Living right now?
At this very moment, I'm in Texas.
Right.
I travel here and there a bit, though.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to California for a little bit.
Yeah. Whereabouts in Texas?
Houston.
Oh, Houston. Oh, that's a great city. Talk about complex, diverse, multicultural place.
It's a very diverse place.
And pretty hot too.
Triple digits.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Well, enjoy the summer, although hopefully it'll cool down the next month or two. Maybe.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.